everyone, it's Allie, and today we are going to talk about a very broken interaction that you can add to your Void Knight very easily to make yourself substantially tankier. The squishiness of Void Knight has always been its downside, and it's been the reason it's not been able to push into very high corruption anymore. Void Knight does a lot of damage while at the same time having great clear, but just simply due to the fact that Sentinel in general doesn't have very good less damage taken multipliers that make it tanky as other classes are. Sentinel in general has never been able to push too far, with the exception of builds that are able to scale their tankiness to somewhat of a decent degree, such as Void Knight being able to scale all of its damage through just stacking vitality, allowing some Sentinel builds to perform pretty well. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Sentinel is just not a very good pusher, but with the release of the new Healing Hands pageantry, we're actually able to mostly mitigate this, allowing us to be very, very tanky. So here we are in game with a pretty decently endgame Void Knight Autobomber. I have around 4,500 health, and I have some pretty decent gear on my character. If I were to go into Modulus with this, I'd be able to push about 300-ish to 350 corruption with my current setup. And the issue here is going to be, well, my life pool is going to be very small. But as I'm about to show you, that's not going to be a problem anymore. With the new Healing Hands tree, every time I smite, I'm now going to be gaining hundreds and hundreds of ward every single smite. And as you can see, I'm going to be hitting thousands of ward very consistently, and I'm going to be able to hold this thousands of ward very, very easily. This is going to give us amazing, amazing tankiness on any sort of boss that you might want to consider fighting, allowing this build to finally be a pretty decent bosser, consistently gaining hundreds of wards per second with every single smite. At the same time, while we aren't going to really be pressing smite, which is going to be giving us this interaction while mapping, we can instead just be pressing Healing Hands as a traversal skill, still giving us about 1,000 ward every time we press it, giving us at least some sort of a barrier every time we run around in a map. Now, what I want to very quickly highlight is how important healing effectiveness is going to be in this setup. As you saw earlier, I was able to hold about 4,000 ward with a decently set up endgame character. Now, I'm going to show you what it would look like if you were to stack healing effectiveness everywhere you could. It's going to be with 2 healing effectiveness rings, a healing effectiveness amulet, and the healing effectiveness implicit relic. Now, obviously, some of this gear is not going to be crafted, as I don't really have healing effectiveness gear lying around, but I just want to show you just how powerful it's going to be for you to actually go ahead and want to stack this stat everywhere you can. Nice thing is that it's on an implicit, so getting this on rings is not very difficult, given that most ring implicits are kind of garbage for us. We only have void damage and critical strike chance to worry about for prefixes, so we can very easily just drop the void damage for critical strike chance and healing effectiveness. So as you saw earlier, I was able to hit about 4,000 ward. Well, as you're going to be able to see now, I am going to get substantially more ward. Now, it's just shy of having enough healing effectiveness to be able to hit 10,000 ward. But as you can see, I am very, very close to 10,000 ward. With this setup, you are just not going to die on a Void Knight Autobomber. And the more cast speed you have, the better. Because not only does cast speed massively scale your smite DPS, but at the same time, cast speed is now going to massively scale your tankiness. The other thing to mention as well is if I were to press a single healing hands to travel around, I would immediately go from having 0 ward all the way up to 2,000 ward, giving me 2,000 ward every single time I use my mobility skill. You really, really want to make sure you focus on healing effectiveness, as it's going to make a massive difference in this build, and it's going to now basically make you immortal. Now, how is this actually done, and how can we fit this into our current build? Well, all this is being done through Healing Hands. We are currently using Healing Hands for Rive's Chariot, which is allowing us to use it as a traversal skill, which is an amazing buff for this build, given that this build has never had a targetable traversal skill, making some bosses feel kind of annoying to do. When we add this to Sun Shroud, giving us immunity while moving, this means that we can use this as a dash to get through some certain abilities that otherwise would immediately kill us. Leading to all this was Hand of Aurelius, give us a 100% chance to cast Healing Hands every time we smite. What we've been doing in this build is going over to the right, giving ourselves Halted Scourge and Turn Undead to give us a little bit of tankiness against necrotic and void damage, and then just going over and picking up Vow Restoration to give us a decent amount of regeneration per second. Well, what we're going to be doing now is instead picking up Divine Barrier. What Divine Barrier is going to do is if your Healing Hands hits someone that has some sort of low life mod on them, it instead is going to be turning the healing that Healing Hands would have provided into ward. The reason this node works this way is because if you were attempting to use this with a friend that is playing low life, you would just be healing them, giving them health, making their low life setup a lot worse, as they'd be gaining less ward per second due to low life specifically needing you to be at low health. The way we can fit this into our build while at the same time not being a low life build is by simply just going and getting ourselves the experimental glove mod, which is just a low life roll. Typically, you need to get yourself either a Exsanguinous or a Last Episode of Living to do this, but we can specifically just use an experimental glove mod to get the same effect. Now, the powerful thing about this is we can specifically go and hunt a bad roll of the experimental glove mod. Here I have a tier 4 roll, which is giving me 9%. Ideally, we want this to be as low of a tier as possible. We ideally want tier 1 role, because that's going to mean that the drain effect on our health, as you can see, we kind of sit at low health, is going to be substantially lower, meaning that we don't have to really worry about it too much. Now, obviously, if I'm just standing here and if I'm not attacking anything, my health is going to drain very quickly, which is going to be a downside, as that means you're not going to be immediately always at full health. But due to the amazing leech that this build has, and the amazing leech that is basically the biggest defensive layer of this build, as soon as I am to attack an enemy, I'm going to get so much leech so quickly that it really isn't a problem. I could very easily deal with any of the drain effect that all this is giving me, especially when I also get 4,000 word on top of all this. Now, to pair with all this, we will be changing our tree around a little bit. We're going to be dropping everything on the right, and we're going to completely ignore it. We need to come down over here and pick up Blessed Parish and still pick up Purity of Thought to actually make our healing hands free. This build already has some pretty bad mana issues, so we can't realistically expend any more mana on healing hands. And then what we're going to do is going to pick up 4 points in Prayer of the Fallen, which is going to give us 100% increased healing effectiveness, which just means we get 100% increased ward, as this still scales off of healing effectiveness. We are then going to pick up Urgent Healing, which gives us 140 flat upfront heals on every single one of the healing hands we do, which just means it's an additional 140 ward on every single smite that we do. We're then going to go and pick up Homeward, and this is going to give us an additional 18% healing effectiveness. And ideally, with our last few points, we would then go and pick up Synthesis of Light, which is going to give us a word per second for healing effectiveness. And finally, we would go over and get Guardian's Chant. Guardian's Chant is going to be what makes this even more broken. Currently, I'm showing you a setup that can hold about 4,000 ward, but if you had 3 points in Guardian's Chant, you would be gaining 30% of the upfront ward as word per second. This means that you'd be gaining somewhere around an additional 300 word per second from every single smite that you do. Now, obviously, you can only have one of these going at any times, but that 300 word per second is going to counteract the decay pretty heavily, allowing my current setup to go from somewhere around 4,000 consistent word to somewhere around 5,000 consistent word, making this build substantially tankier. With all this put together, Void Knight Autobomber is going to be substantially tankier now. Now, I do want to mention that the build guide will be updated with all this, and in the description below, there will be a new build planner and a new loot filter that is going to include all of the changes that we made here. The biggest thing that you want to take away from this is that you now need to make sure you get yourself an experimental low life roll on your gloves, and ideally you're going to want to find yourself additional levels of healing hands, as with just the 20 points, we cannot pick up 3 points in Guardian's Chance, and we are going to need a few extra levels. It's okay if you don't have a few extra levels to begin with, that's completely fine, but ideally eventually you will want to be able to pick up all of the points that you need in Guardian's Chant. I hope this helps you cuties along with your journey of playing Void Knight Autobomber, and I hope that this makes you substantially tankier and lets you push a little bit higher corruption, and at the end of the day, this is going to give you substantially better bossing, so you should have substantially of an easier time doing aura abysses or doing dungeons or doing any of the bosses that are at the end of each monolith. I am impressed by just how good this is, and the fact that all this really needs is just a simple rework of your tree to immediately fit it in is just probably the single biggest buff that this build could have gotten. This build really doesn't need more damage or any sort of mobility, it just needed more tankiness, and well, we now have ourselves the extra tankiness that this build was needing. If you have any questions, cuties, feel free to leave a comment in the description below. I'll be more than happy to help you as soon as I can, or otherwise you can come by Twitch, and I can always help you there at any time as well. If you just simply want to come by Twitch and hang out with all the cuties, I'll be more than happy to see you around, and outside of that, I'll see you cuties in the next video, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.